Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining
Morning, sir.
our talk. Thank you. Morning, Iva. Today we have Russel Hlongwane, who is not an architect, but has worked a lot with architects. I think some of you might know him from the URA 2014 organizing committee. Morning, Nina. Colleagues, before we start this morning, I'll just like us to have a moment of silence to respect Rodney Harper, who has just passed on recently. Thank you. We'll go straight to it. I'll introduce Russel, and then Russel, the stage will be yours, sir. Russel Hlongwane is a cultural producer and working at the intersection of heritage, tradition, and culture as they pertain to Black life, often engaging film, performance, design, and installation to bring form to his theoretical questions. Mr. Hlongwane, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Skura. Good morning to the architectural fraternity and community. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you today. I've obviously got a deck in front of me. I'm also reading my notes just so that my ideas kind of come out as precise as possible and kind of I don't meander in what I want to articulate. So I'm based in Durban, but due to the nature of work, I'm constantly moving around, but Durban remains home and a place that I'm very, very attached to. It's also a place of great frustration as well. And so I'll get right into it. Somewhere kind of midway through the presentation, there are 3 video clips that I'll play. But otherwise, it's kind of just me talking for approximately an hour. So bear with me and let's get into it. So the title of the talk is Perusing the Ruins and the Potentials of eThekwini through Southern Urbanism. As a kind of problem statement or some thinking points, is how do we make sense of the collapse in Durban? Is where do we find the imagination to read in order to write back an urban reality that's unfolding before our eyes? And I reckon there are many versions of Durban. There's the insurgent, there's the official, there's the rogue, amongst others. In my view, each and every one of these are failing for various different reasons. And so in light of this failure of the insurgents, the official, and the rogue, amongst others, what is emerging beyond that which is failing? And so part of the inquiry is to figure out how to make sense and how to hold at equal value and pay attention to these multiple urban forms, urban activities, and their actors, as a way of writing something beyond the kind of lamentation, the frustration, and the kind of naive optimism that one might have. And so how to think critically with this reality, you know? And could it be that perhaps the failure also sits with us as spatial practitioners, architects, planners, and so on and so forth? Is it that we perhaps are not conversant enough in multiple languages to think about and kind of read this urban reality that's unfolding in front of us? And if that's the case, then where does one go? Where does one look to kind of pick up some multiple lens or pick up a kind of vocabulary to think about this? And so I want to use this field of, or at least this kind of area of Southern urbanism as a way to think about and think through Durban, you know. And so what I've done here is to kind of collapse a number of observations, preoccupations, concerns that have kind of gathered over the past 10 to 15 years or so. So the talk meanders from the personal to the scale of the family, meaning that I'll be reflecting and drawing upon the experience of my family, my cousins, my uncles, and distant relatives who are spread across Durban, spread across the many kind of surrounding peri-urban areas, as well as the rural areas. I want to draw from their experience, and I kind of want to place this alongside kind of academics who have been thinking in a very particular mode of producing architectural or spatial knowledge. So I kind of want to use both of these kind of knowledges as a way for myself to make sense of what's in front of me. So with that said, the talk is tangential. There are parts to this that are unresolved. Some parts are clearer than others. It moves between the subjective and the objective, the empirical and the somewhat factual. And so what I encourage you to do is to kind of just ride along and see where we end up at the end. It's important for me to say quite early that the talk does not intend to point fingers, nor does it assume a higher moral ground. It doesn't intend to induce shock. Rather, I'm kind of putting forward some ways of configuring or asking better questions, reading challenges. And why I want to focus on the kind of on the reading and the formulating of questions is partly because if I use, say, the analogy of language, if an isiZulu speaker asks a language in isiZulu to someone who does not speak isiZulu, the understanding of the question will determine a lot of how the response or the answer is conceived and delivered. And so I want to take this way of thinking about language and apply that kind of analogy in the realm of architecture or spatial practice, which is to say, the kinds of behaviors that we are required to read, the kinds of activities and postures and belief systems, memories, etc., that one needs to design and make for. If we cannot understand those really well, then how accurate might be the response in both form? And I've said here, if the majority for which we are producing space perform and make decisions in ways that we deem as counterintuitive, then does that not require us to ask ourselves about the accuracy of our intuition, our intellectual source, and our points of reference. And so to kind of point the finger back at myself, this talk has forced me to put into words a spectrum of emotions, thoughts, propositions of what Durban has become over the past 15 years, but more sharply and profoundly over the past 4 years. And this is defined, or at least as is done by a few kind of unfortunate events. The urban decay as a result of the civil unrest of, I think, 2021, the floods that followed. It's been the death of Dr. Mangosuthu Buthelezi, coupled that with the Kotama of Kingswell Teen, and the various mafias of Durban that have encroached on the public and private sector over the past 3 years or so, at least as far as I've understood these. And I think the kind of the cumulative effects of these incidences have created a very particular condition that I think puts Durban in a very unique and different place from, and make it a different place from the rest of Johannesburg and Cape Town, to talk of the biggest cities. And what I've been interested in as these events have occurred is the online discourse that has emerged in response to this. And these kind of Facebook communities have been the source of the images that I'll be speaking to and sharing with you. And these online communities span race. They kind of folks who identify as Black, who are kind of making certain claims in that safe space, so to speak. There are also peeps who are racialized as whites, who are making certain claims and lamentations about, a bunch of factors, as well as folks who are racialized Indian and folks who are racialized colored. So it's really kind of drawing from these multiple communities as a way for me to think about what is being said about Durban and how are people processing this, and how does someone like myself, who's an artist, respond, who's interested in the city, respond and kind of produce work that stimulates, if not provokes, this kind of discourse that's happening online. Partly it's because, I think the online environment has created a really strange private-public contract that is at times blurry. And so you're also able to see people's disgust in much more grotesque ways than you would in real life. And so the image that's in front of you, I'm kind of getting into the presentation now. The image in front of you is my understanding of Durban, which is to say there are 4 Durbans in my view. There is the Durban of KwaMashu, Lamont, Claremont, Chesterville, and so on and so forth. There's another Durban of Musgrave, of Kloof, Westville, Morningside, Montclair, Bluff, and so on and so forth. Then there's a third Durban, and this is in no particular order. The third Durban is of Chatsworth, Phoenix, Wilbur Dutch, Reservoir Hills, Overport, and so on and so forth. And then there's the other Durban, the Durban of Newlands East, Durban of Sydenham, Durban of Wentworth, for example. And for a long time, we in society was cut in these ways. And so to a very large degree, each category pretty much defined or had a huge influence of how you understood Durban, how you understood political agency, economic agency or opportunity, belief system, etc., etc. There are very specific racial codes, cultural behaviors, as I've mentioned. And maybe I should say that I appreciate that I'm making totalizing statements here, and I know that there were diversity amongst these communities, but for the majority, these kinds of generalizations would hold. And so each of these categories could be described quite clinically and simply. We knew what to expect from and in the suburbs. The same applies to a township, all right? And I want us to park this kind of four corners of Durban. Since 94, there appeared a set of characteristics to these places. The suburbs experienced a new form of Black spectre. White people had to figure out what to do with Black neighbors. Townships, on the other hand, kind of, in my view, was a place where new subject formations were taking place. And so there was a move from wealthy Black folk into suburbia. There was a kind of new energy that was animating and kind of becoming in township environments. And so perhaps not so much in the built form that there was a transformation, but certainly in the way that people were experiencing and occupying space was starting to change. In my view, in the suburbs, there was not the same kinds of changes. And I think the urban changes that we saw were bookended by the white and the Black experience to a large degree. There were spaces in between where kind of movements were happening, and I'll speak to this a bit later on. But for now, I kind of want to talk about the two areas that bookend this. And so in the townships, you had Kwaito music that was defining, articulating, and kind of writing into being a way that young Black folk were articulating a political voice, exuberance, sense of style, etc., etc. There was also a set of kind of commercial activities like shisanyama, car washes, and so on and so forth, that also kind of attracted a very particular kind of economic as well as audience or a clientele. Later on, further into the 90s, into the early 2000s, we saw the explosion of backroom, so these are kind of 1 or 2 bedroom structures that would be built in the back of the home, used as a rental as a way to subsidize income. As this was happening in the townships, there was something else that was emerging through my observation, which was the peri-urban areas that were starting to take on, I would say, a different shape. There was a much stronger dialogue between the kind of townships of Durban and the peri-urban areas that were in proximity to these places. And so you saw a much stronger connection, a much stronger conversation between the peri-urban and the core. And in some way, I think what we are faced with now is a kind of blurred line between what is township and what is peri-urban. And so there's a kind of new urban kind of formation that's starting to take shape there. So places like Groundville, Ilovu, Kwanyuswa, Emnini, have since become kind of translocal areas that we're needing to make sense of. And part of my point is, in order to resolve and to think about what is taking shape in Durban, one has to think about what's happening in these places and see what the connection between these two places are. And so in thinking about centering the peri-urban, one has to think of 2 more populations that one has to account for that is also aggressively making their way into the city. And these are migrant workers from other African countries and the more domestic rural subjects that are moving from rural areas into Durban. So these are not particularly people coming from the peri-urban, but it's people coming from the rural areas. And in my view, if we cannot solve for the needs and understand the subject positions of these people, then our work as urban scholars and practitioners will largely be futile. So if our work is to reach scale and resolve issues at that level, this is the population that, in my view, we would need to spend enough time trying to cater, account for, and make sense of. So kind of just looking at images here of these populations. So on the top left, on the top right, for example, is a group called Amabinga. It's kind of self-identified as Amabinga, kind of rural folks who are very proud of who they come as, and they arrive in the city and kind of have a rather staunch sensibility and a sense of self, of who they are, what their belief systems are. But in my view, the person who leaves the rural areas is not the same person who arrives in the city. So there's a shift that starts to happen, and it's this shift that I think is requiring us to invent a vocabulary, to speak about, to think with, and write this kind of subjects into urban theory or urban discourse. And through that is to understand how are such subjects accommodated, responded to, and supported in the city. The same could be said. I mean, there's a strip in town in Durban, in Durban Center, for example, from Park Street all the way up to Russell Street, which I call Little Addis, and it's a kind of really interesting and dynamic space. And I think the Ethiopian and Eritrean community in the context of Durban have really worked themselves into the urban fabric, as well as into a kind of economic activity that goes beyond race and religion. And I think it makes them really different from other African migrants who've come into the city and operated kind of below the radar, so to speak. And so if one looks at the foundations, if one looks at the skeleton or the bare bones of what we've inherited as spatial thinkers and urban scholars, the men that we see here, say Lefebvre and Simmel and Benjamin and so on, these are kind of the people who had done the meticulous and painstaking work of grappling with what the European kind of society and individual was thinking about, and kind of how were they responding to a capitalist state that was kind of starting to hold and have a very strong grip in Europe. Yeah. And so much of what we understand and how we understand about how people make place, how people make sense of their environments, and what it means to move from rural areas into dense urban areas. We look back and we look at these men, and much of what they said spoke in a very compelling and elegant way about the European experience. But I wonder if we can expect these men who came from very specific contexts and times can speak as elegantly and provide the kinds of reliable solutions for the urban formations that are taking shape in the post-colonies, in the global South, for example. And it's important that I say that I do not discredit the work they did. The question I'm asking is if it's reasonable for us to depend on the theories that they produced for us to respond and contend with the situation that we faced in these places, which are the South. And I think in our context, the African context, as well as more broadly the South, is animated by a kind of turn, which is kind of the wave of independence, right? So between the late 50s all the way into the 80s, perhaps not so much the 90s, because the stakes had been kind of stated and it was very clear what the future would hold. But certainly the restlessness, the altered states of Africa between the late 50s into the 80s were animated by a bunch of kind of new experiences that we as African or Black or brown folk had never confronted before, right? And so this, in many ways, starts to set the challenges that we have to contend with, the shift of power, the shift of power from states or from governments that had a very far-reaching effect and grip on society. So the colonial kind of force had this extreme reach into how people were moving, living, occupying, and spending to a large degree. And so you had the second wave of people who were moving from the rural into the urban environments, the states did not have as strong a reach. The states in itself was much more disorganized than the previous kind of power structures that were in place. There was a shift of an infrastructure that was built for the elites that suddenly has to supply the whole population. And more importantly, when the colonial kind of cities were being built on the continent, there was a massive amount of finances that was flowing from the colonies into Europe and flowing back to develop and build the colonial city. But what you had from the late 50s, the 60s, all the way into the 80s is a kind of, it's a block of that financial stream that can kind of bankroll and kind of support a very accelerated urban expansion. At the same time, we had really interesting thinkers who were formulating and grappling with the society that was evolving and opening up in front of their eyes. And so on the one hand, you had the colonial powers that were still trying to have a strong influence and effects in the post-colony. You had developments and kind of economic reforms as a result of which you had the non-aligned movements, the New Left, and so on and so forth. And out of this, some interesting work had come out, such as I'm just quoting some of the really interesting and important works that really started to articulate and speak about what the continent was going through, not just the continent, but the global South. So Spivak, for example, with the Subaltern kind of, you know, putting her own flavor into that discourse, thinking of Walter Rodney and thinking about his own kind of thinking of how Europe had underdeveloped Africa. Stuart Hall can be added here. And these were thinkers who were trying to grapple with what it means to be Black in Europe, what it means to be Black in or on the continent, and what it means to move between the post-colony and the power of Europe. And some really interesting work also through Frantz Fanon as well. And so suddenly there was this new way for us to read ourselves. There was a new way for us to make sense of what was happening in front of us. But what became clear is the fact that there's a shared political moment that's kind of taking form across the global South. And so the idea, the thinking was, how then do we come together and make sense of this kind of shared reality that we are going through as the global South, as the post-colony. Okay, I'm just also checking time here.
We're going well.
Yeah, okay, cool. Out of this were really interesting experiments around how does the post-colony carve out space? How does it think about kind of the urban fabric? Trying to carve out a way that does not rely heavily on Europe. I mean, some of these are really complicated. Some of these were executed in really complicated ways. In the case of the DRC, for example, under Mobutu's rule, but more positively in the context of Tanzania through the Ujamaa Ujamaa villages, for example, like new ways where, you know, these people are trying to think of how do you work in a way that is not grotesquely capitalistic at the same time, does not depend heavily and draw on a kind of failed communist imagination, at least an ailing communist imagination. And so there was a kind of way of carving out and thinking about the Black person and so-called modernity and so on. So much so that a lot of these experiments had really, really interesting afterlives. So the image that's bottom right, at least on my side, I don't know if it's the same on your end. I can't pronounce the name and surname, but it's Jean Prouve, was a kind of very important designer who had made these buildings, had designed these buildings, and then sent them through to the DRC, if I'm not mistaken. And so they were kind of occupied by Belgian and French people. And when the French and the Belgians had left the DRC, you kind of had the supply of really prestigious buildings, so to speak, according to design terms. They were kind of utilized in all kinds of strange ways by subjects, by people who lived here. In fact, there's a really interesting documentary where they trace the trajectory of these houses after the colonial period. The same was happening, the same kinds of experiments were happening across Asia, right? And so this was not only happening in and on the continents. Early on, I had spoken about the subjects that I think or feel we need to pay greater attention to in trying to understand what might be their demands and their expectations of space, particularly the urban environment. And so what I have here is a building, the one to the left, is a building in Warwick, Asemagete. The other is a kind of Art Deco building. And the other had kind of remnants of Art Deco, but of course it's been reconfigured in a bunch of ways. Now the question is, what is to be done with the tensions around infrastructure that had a particular kind of value and importance to a particular demographic? And what happens when that infrastructure is an impediment to another population? And so these are people who kind of come into the city to kind of eke out a living, yeah, however precarious that living might be. And so on the one hand, there's a need to preserve and maintain kind of a set of assets. On the other hand, these assets are understood as an impediment, they're understood as a blockage to the system, as they're understood as a blockage to people who desperately are needing to occupy and make life in the city. Now, am I advocating for the demolition and the defacing of Art Deco buildings and other heritage buildings? No. What I am asking is, what does it require us? Like, how do we move between the value that's associated with a particular population against the needs of another population? Yeah. And what becomes the conversation that does not kind of force us to kind of remain more staunch in our ways and how we think about it, but kind of how do we enter this conversation in a way that allows us to be reflexive enough and go back and forward? And early on, I had spoken about the kind of the clinical and neat ways that one could talk about these four categories of Durban. And so one could understand and know what to expect in a township, in a suburb, and so on and so forth. This is a restaurant on Devonport. It's a place Devonport itself, or Glenwood is a place that I reside in. And to people who are in Durban, they would know this place. But this is not the Devonport that exists today. In fact, if one does a very meticulous reading of the activity in Devonport, one could say some of this activity does not belong in Devonport. It belongs elsewhere, right? Part of this is kind of what is termed informal trade. There's a piece of property there that was occupied by a restaurant that is now vacant. And so there's some folks selling loose cigarettes and other things, which maybe I can't speak very confidently to. And so what this means in a way that there's a level of, say, quote unquote, township activity that one finds in Devonport. And I think Devonport is a really interesting case for the fact that it has not gone to the dogs, as people might talk about, places that kind of go through this kind of experience. On the other hand, it's not the good old days of Natal, for example. And so the one has to ask, what is Devonport? Do we have the vocabulary to talk about and normalize this kind of experience? When I say normalize it, it's not necessarily to condone it, but I'm definitely not here to speak ill of it, right? And so what is that center point between these two kind of positions? To move from Devonport and go into the expanse of the Bria, so on the top, on the left is a masjid that's on St. Thomas. And what you see to the right is Old Bria, the good old days, as some people might say. And this kind of shift and change is happening in a really interesting way in the areas of the Bria. I would say more so than any other environments, partly because of the building stock that occupies the Bria and the kinds of, perhaps not so much tensions, but certainly the ebbs and flows and the multiple societies that you're finding in areas of Morningside, Musgrave, and so on. And so, in my view, instead of trying to convene strategically and hijack a crisis that's kind of engulfing the entire Durban, rather what we have is a kind of, it's a critique of what they're doing to the Bria. It's a kind of, it's a negative speech, really. And I think seldom have people who are working with space come together to figure out how to make sense of this and how to think of a much more ethical occupation and process of urbanization. Yeah. What is interesting is that we've seen a kind of economic activity that has moved with this flow, particularly estate agencies here, security companies, and a number of other commercial actors that have hijacked, in fact, this kind of splits in the societies of these areas that I've mentioned. Unfortunately, I don't think architects or planners have done enough of that work, that preparatory work. And I'm not just speaking about the Bria here, I'm talking about the crisis of Durban as a whole in its entirety. And I'm just using areas that I'm very familiar with as a way to demonstrate and make a point. And so I'll stop my tangent on the Bria and I'll play 3 clips. And these 3 clips in some way is a kind of, I'm validating the points I made earlier on about needing to think about the peri-urban that's in conversation to the township and the township that is in conversation to the so-called center, right? And to kind of demonstrate that there is a set of activities that I don't think we are calculated enough to respond to, not in the built form, but at first at a psychological level. And so I'll stop and I'll kind of let the video clips do that work for me. So if you cannot hear the sound, please try to notify me. And the best way is if you can just speak into your mic. So I'm sharing screen now and so I'll stop that one. I hope everyone can hear this, right? I haven't heard anything but Skora affirming that he can hear this. All right. I'll play the second clip. So clearly that's happening in a rondavo, and it looks like one of those old school rondavos. So we can safely assume that it's in a rural environment. Show these grand statements. I'm sharing screen again to play the second clip, which I think is closer to Durban. Play the last clip. No. And this for me is perhaps the most important for reasons that you will soon know. There it is. Okay. So this is West Streets. Okay. And I now play the last of these clips. Skura, I'm mindful of time, so don't stress.
No, we still good, so.
All right, yeah, I see this. All right, I play this clip, which is only 60 seconds.
Hey, hustler! You're gonna cut you, okay? Open!
Okay. So I want to use these clips to ask the question. I want to apply this question. I want to apply the question of aesthetics and ask, does the visual language or the material semblance of arts, decor, and Cape Dutch, all of which are heritage buildings, amongst others. Do we really think that these buildings have the same sentimental value that it does to this population as it does to us? And why is it a surprise when someone, quote unquote, destroys or defaces or simply looks past that building? Is it therefore fair for us to insist on a set of buildings that hold treasure to some of us when they seem as an impediment to the majority, as I'd mentioned? And the question here, sorry, I'm losing my notes here. The consideration here is increasingly there's been the failure in formal planning for and of African cities. Alongside this, we've seen a rich tapestry of activity. And this activity has happened otherwise, outside of kind of formal structures. And time and again, we've tried to implement change. And time and again, that change has failed. We've looked at the logics of urban studies and we've said, surely if we do A, B, and C, it goes to reason that people will act in ways that are 1, 2, 3. But this hasn't worked. And this is why I'd spoken about the need for us to apply our minds to this kind of subject who's making their way into Durban as a way for us to get to meet them and see what might be their ask of the urban environments. So 819 here. This is a map that I was looking at as I was preparing for this talk, and it's the map of Durban, obviously. And I had to wake up to the fact that actually the blue it does not indicate water. It's actually black bodies. And this is of 2011. I don't think much has changed. If anything, that blue has gotten denser. You might see some say orange and pink having migrated out of these places to other contexts. And so one can safely assume that not much has changed in terms of the spatial arrangements of Durban. But for me, the interest is not so much in the built form. It's the psychology that informs what then gets built. And so this map then kind of leads me. I'm entering my last few slides here. My own way of trying to interrogate this subject that I've been talking about here. It led me to think about the history of Blackness in Durban. And so in other words, I'm trying to make sense of the city that my grandmother inherited, inhabited. And at the moment, we're doing a project that I think is starting to point in a really interesting and productive direction. So if one looks at, say, maybe let me talk about the projects first, and then I'll talk about the men that I'm currently researching. So the project is looking at the Durban system, which I shouldn't get into the details of, but it's a system that collapsed somewhere in the late 60s, if not the 70s. And what this project has done is allowed me to go deep into research and documentation of the Durban Corporation in the development of the first townships of Durban, and some of the Black characters that were heavily involved in this process. So the kind of the Bantu social clubs, the Bantu Urban Council, I think it was called. And what you have is kind of this Black intelligentsia that were, so these are some of the riots that were connected to the Durban system. But some of these actors you see here in front of you. So it's A.B. Duma, it's R.R. Dlomo, who was a journalist and kind of published as well. It's John Langalbalele, it's Makema Fuze, and one who's really, really fascinating for me is AWG Champion. And these men, in the same way that the kind of the so-called forefathers of urban theory were committed and obsessing over the psychologies that were coming out of European society as a result of capitalism and rapid urbanization, these men were starting to articulate that in various ways. Some of it was direct confrontation with the colonial government and the apartheid states. Some of them were doing this through literary forms. There's a rich repository of telenovelas from the 80s into the 90s that were writing into being an urban Black subject that we would later encounter or inhabit, in fact, in the 90s. And so if and when you look at the history of Durban, for example, these men and this one woman, and I'm sure there are more, are footnotes. They're incidental to the history of Durban. And so the work is, what happens when you center these voices that are footnotes in the history of Durban? What history opens up, and how can we take fragments of that history and try to work with it to the present? And so myself, who was raised in Overport, to a domestic worker who was moving between these four quadrants of Durban, what we see today is not strange. In fact, it had been taking form for a while. It just happened that it was still pushed and it was at the margins. Now, the terror and the horror that was out there is at our doorstep. And I think we lose the point if we can only speak negatively about this new urban form that's playing out in front of us. I think there's a potential for us to work with other pockets of history and people who've inhabited the city. In my view, these people were articulating an urban frustration in the early 1900s. The chickens have come home to roost, I think the saying goes. And sometimes it concerns me the level to which individuals or professionals in the built environment aren't engaging enough with the current urban frustrations that we see, we hear about, but it's a convenience for us to turn a blind eye and rather resort and look at the good old Durban. Now, I must say that this is not a kind of a point on race, because there are other groups, the other race groups making very particular claims over space in this kind of urban morphology that we see. And somehow, I'm not sure what the imagination is, but I've hung myself onto the works of these individuals and the repository that they present to me to gather how I might make sense of the present. Why? Because these people are writing about what we eventually see in our cities today. Now, this is just my kind of archive that I'm working with, but there are many others. And what would be interesting for me is to bring out those archives and let them coexist as a way of writing a much more kind of wholesome image of what Durban has become over the past 15 years, but more specifically over the past 5 years. I mean, I think I'll stop here, Skura, because we are just about on time. This is a project of ours that we did, where we were kind of reading the visual language of Durban, and through that we are kind of trying to track and trace and make sense of secondhand clothing, as well as informal trade in the city center, but using a visual language that is kind of native to Durban, so to speak. And so if you kind of, if you move around enough in Durban, you would have seen these either on walls, as you see it here, or in kind of on taxis and buses that kind of commute folks back and forth. So I'll stop here, and these are kind of my ways that I'm trying to peel another layer and kind of etch out another slice that helps me make sense of the catastrophe and the center of collapse that is Durban. I'll stop sharing.
Russell, thank you so much. Yeah, you're making us think so hard so early in the morning. Colleagues, the floor is open for questions and comments following the presentation. If I understand you well, Russell, you are not denying the fact that an African city has many layers, but you are simply saying, how can we bring all of that together? Am I right?
Yeah. That's what I'm saying, indeed. Yes.
You know, as South Africans, we are very uncomfortable to talk about race. And it is our reality. It is a huge part of our history as well. Do you feel that we don't engage enough with situations pertaining to race? I know that your presentation goes beyond that, of course.
I think we engage too much in race. I don't know if we do so in the most productive of ways. And I think this is why it often kind of ends up quite messy. And so there's a kind of, I don't know, a maturity that we all need to develop when talking about matters of race.
Okay, lovely. Any hand, colleagues? Russell, since you are the presenter, and I know that this may not necessarily be a question you are able to answer directly, but let me pose it anyway. Obviously, as the institute, we abide by law and we support the Heritage Act as it is now. Under AMAFA, the Research Institute. But at the same time, I do think that there is a space for debate. You did speak about the Art Deco buildings and how the demand may change from when the buildings were created, right? I had a discussion some time back when the restaurant Zai at the bottom floor of the road, before it opened, the owner called me and he was complaining about some of the elements that him and the architect working on the job were not in agreement with AMAFA about. And at the end of the discussion, what he said was, you know, there is a scenario that I was not part of in defining as a style, as what defines Durban. I was not part of that. My forefathers were not part of that. And finally, I'm able to do something in the city, but still I must conform to a definition that I was not part of. I don't know if you get me, Russell.
Yeah, I do.
So it brings now a debate on being able to repurpose, reconsider things that we've always known in a particular way. So that was his reality. He says, I was not part of defining that. While now I can own something in the city, I must still now subject myself to that. I do not have an opportunity to define a language of my own. What can you say about that?
I mean, I'm at least smart enough to know that the topic of heritage and AMAFA is very, very topical and complicated amongst architects. So I will try not get entangled in in that messy conversation. But what I can say is this. My grandmother doesn't speak very much about her early days of Durban. And so whenever people talk about the good old days, or whenever people talk about this pristine building that meant this, and there's kind of childhood memories attached to that, I know that at more or less that same time that you had those privileges, my grandmother was in your kitchen doing a bunch of activities that she probably didn't enjoy under very constrained conditions, yeah? And so if that reality can coexist with your childhood memories, because I don't want to discredit your childhood memories, and if through that we can understand that your childhood memories can be held in the same breath as... You want to pause? Okay, great, thank you. And so if the kind of the childhood memories of someone who grew up on the Brea in these Art Deco buildings can be placed alongside the frustrations and the traumas of my grandmother, then what does that allow us to talk about? And could that kind of open up something a bit more productive than me denying you of your childhood memories and you denying someone else of a building that they are desperately needing to activate in order for them to make a living. So I'll kind of just use my personal history as a way to respond to your question. Yeah, but I do see some hands up here.
Yeah. I must apologize, Kirk, Adima, and Karuni. I did not see the hands. I'll start with Kirk because this is the order I'm seeing: Kirk, Adima, and then Karuni.
Yes, hello, hi. Thanks, Russell. Interesting. I have a question, a query rather than a challenge or comment. You showed the clip of the police breaking up a whole lot of internal partitions, and I presume that's an invaded building or something. I think the photographer was a very brave person walking amongst the police like that. That's absolutely amazing. What really was the comment you were making, though, is my question on that. What did we see? Thanks.
I didn't want to make a comment on that because I felt that the video makes the point, but it is because I kind of played those 3 clips back to back as a way to emphasize that there's an explosion that's waiting to happen. At this moment, it's at a hostel in Delton, which is not far from Umbilo, Glenwood, and so on and so forth. And slowly, this activity is moving closer and closer to the places we call the suburbs. Yeah, and if we don't kind of wake up to this reality and this kind of pent-up frustration, it may not be in Delton in 2 years' time. It'll be your neighbor, possibly. And it's and I don't mean this as a way to kind of to shock, you know. But the first clip was of like a Shembe congregation kind of in dance and song in a rural area. And the next clip was in a peri-urban. The next clip was in West Street. And I can imagine what kinds of questions, or at least I had a bunch of questions around like permits, etc. But there's something one cannot deny is the jubilant kind of energy that's pulsating in that activity. And so when we put up questions around bylaws and kind of land use, etc., there's this other thing. There's this other use that people see for the streets, you know? And I don't know if our urban environment has made room for that. We might have parks that are dilapidated, but there's a kind of utility that the street has beyond vehicle traffic, for example. And so the Dalton hostel clip was really to to bring to the fore the forms of occupation that are maybe 200 meters from some of us who are on this call, you know? And we don't see it, but tomorrow it'll be much closer and we will not have time to see it. In fact, we will be directly affected by this kind of urban occupation. This was the point I was trying to make through that clip. I hope this answers the question, Kirk.
Okay, thanks, Russel. Atima?
Oopsie daisy.
Davis?
Thanks, Sarah. How's it, everybody? Hello, Russell. Just thank you for your presentation. You know, I think I'm always very grateful for this platform and the interest that it brings to a Friday morning, and always incredibly grateful for your generous sharing. And I think the ways in which you are so selflessly able to put at once yourself into the framing, but also completely remove yourself at the will and necessity of the discussion. So gratitude for that. I think I maybe want to you know, just talk to something that's coming up for me in a lot of ways, and it was really interesting to listen to your presentation because Sponelo Gray and myself have just been writing on this idea of Save Our Berea and I suppose problematizing the community development initiatives, and maybe just speak on this notion of sanitation. And I think in a lot of ways for me, sanitation and legislation around sanitation, constructs of cultural expressions around sanitation have led to a lot of the kind of complexities in the construction, I suppose, of the ruination of Durban and the ways in which particularly Black heritages have found home in the city. And so I think a lot about sanitation, which is a strange thing to acknowledge. But maybe also just talking about this idea, you know, about this inevitability of the colonial rupture. And so in parallel to my constant thinking about sanitation, I think also about problematizing of democratization, you know, and how in truth the idea of the democratization of our city spaces, our peri-urban, our rural spaces, the democratization on land has failed us. You know, it hasn't prepared or equipped us to have the necessary conversations. And maybe it goes back to this idea of the colonial rupture and the ways that the colonial rupture has been predominantly psychological for us, and how we embody that. And I kind of had a bit of a chuckle when you said, you know, you're smart enough to be aware of how contested the heritage conversation is. But to go back to my favorite word, sanitization, I think part of the problem is that our heritage is fundamentally sanitized and fundamentally whitewashed, you know. And so when we look at what we order to be architectural styles, and I suppose in the spaces and as an architectural educator and historian around the heritage, particularly of a city like eThekwini, constantly need to tell myself to seize the use of the word Durban because we're so much larger than what Durban ever could have been, you know. But I think when we look at heritage, a huge part of the problem is the sanitization of that. And so if we're talking about Art Deco, one needs to look at what the origins of Art Deco was. You know, if we're denying the foundations of the embeddedness of Egyptianate and Indian architecture, Arabesque architecture and Art Deco, then we're creating a white thing that belongs to whiteness. And again, a pause and a disclaimer of everyone, the distinction that we're trying to make is the construct and condition of whiteness rather than the racial identification or categorization of white. And so the problematizing then of the ways in which those heritages belong to particular groups in inverted commas because of sanitation. And so one looks at even, you know, the Natal veranda houses and the imbued ideas of Blackness within them. And for me, my departure point is maybe around remembering who made these places in the first place, because they weren't built by white hands. And so when we're starting to look at what they serve in the city, I think that must be the primal thought. And so I was really appreciative, and I think that that's a fundamental thing to think of, you know. And yeah, I suppose just on that idea of what is reasonable to think of in terms of as we move through from the academic exercise of theorizing our engagements with the city, that was a really beautiful thing. What is reasonable for us to think of? And then where do we position ourselves as highly emotive entities? So just thank you for a really enriching talk, and I'm so glad to hear you again. It's been too long, and we mustn't do that again. But thank you, Shakskura. Thank you, Russel.
Thank you, Adima. Thank you.
Thanks, Adima. Caroline?
Good morning. Hi, Russell. Thank you for that. It prompted me in two ways. You're talking about the urban frustration and the collapse of Durban. I'm actually looking at it as an opportunity now. I think where I am in my life, I think in Durban. Durban's collapsed in a different way to other metropolitan sort of centers in South Africa. And it's quite interesting. I really enjoyed your presentation because I think I understood that collapse a little bit clearer than before. But my question to you, Russell, is there an opportunity in that collapse to understand why it's collapsing, and what are the factors behind that collapse, and so you can understand that urban frustration that you described. It didn't work and it fell apart. So what do we learn, and how does that then impact on all of us, not just as architects? And here I'm talking as a citizen of Durban. The second point is me as an architect and what I bring to the work that I do in heritage, in architecture, on the edges of heritage sometimes. I mean, I live in a 95-year-old house built by a colonial sort of a heritage that we have in Durban. I have a lot of respect for that as an architect. I also have a lot of respect for the heritage that I come with as somebody that came from an indentured sort of a background. So I think with me, and I'm listening to how you express yourself today, and I'm grateful that you did it, Russell, because I think we all come. It's very important that we understand where we come from as architects, and what do we bring to our work. And can all of these heritages coexist in a way, even though they're contested, in a way that they can assist us in sorting out this urban sort of frustration that you explain? Is it contestation to test us, to test our roles, to test our heritage, where we come from, to test our understanding? And where are the solutions in that? So there are two comments. I'd like you to respond to that if you could, Russell. But I'm thinking there's me as a citizen of Durban, and then there's me as an architect. Thank you. Thanks, Kura.
Sure. I mean, I often want to run after delivering a talk, because I need to respond to questions. And one has all the answers. And in this case, I'll always kind of default to the way I kind of am thinking and processing this. So the first point around the collapse and the catastrophe of Durban, I only speak of it from a positive point of view, from a productive point of view, which is to say, we have to hijack the moment. Like the failure, it presents an opportunity for something to be done. But if we can only complain about the crisis, then we lose the opportunity to birth something fresh and something new, right? And I think there's a degree to which the majority of this country is used, and they live with catastrophe, they live with so-called chaos, yeah? And so this collapse that we see is frightening to us who are kind of, class to middle class or such. But I think to other people, this is what's happening in the city center has been coming. People have been living in those conditions. Now, I also don't want to write off people as kind of like hopeless subjects that like have no agency and have no hope, But I think the shock is much greater amongst us than it is to the majority. And so I do feel that through some kind of trans or interdisciplinary working, something can be conjured. So to think across disciplines, professions, race, class, etc., to cut across all of that, to arrive at something beyond. Now, this is how I think of this moment, and this is how I want to use this crisis to think of how I can kind of contribute to this discourse of world making, of world building. Sorry. The second point is I'm of Zulu heritage. It is incredibly important for me to understand that Zuluness, as it takes up so much space in the contestation of heritage and whose heritage is important, and etc. in KZN, I have to acknowledge that there are other nationalities, there are other peoples who come from other places whose heritage has to be foregrounded as well. And so there's a way in which I'm able to mute my so-called pride, or like identity politics for the foregrounding and kind of giving center stage to other heritages, so that one does not. Yeah, I mean, I think I've said the point. I'll stop. I mean, there's something maybe to add onto the point you're making. A project I'm developing at the moment, or at least trying to frame, is to ask what happens when we turn our back on South Africa as Durban and consider ourselves part of the Indian Ocean. Does that allow us to think of our positions in a slightly different way? Right, when we are not in conversation to Cape Town and Johannesburg and the Eastern Cape and so on, but rather to think of ourselves as a location on the Indian Ocean expanse. Like, what does that kind of open up? What does it unhinge? And so this is another way for me to think about my heritage, not as what it is now, but as a way of kind of providing texture, or giving texture, and expanding what it is. So the idea of heritage is not as something that you look back to, but something that you look forward to, or at least you cast forward, yeah? And so in this way, one has to think about heritage as something that's active, that's alive, that's constantly shifting and morphing based on the material conditions and the constraints that the majority is feeling.
Thank you so much, Russell. Ken Lever.
Thanks, Kura. And Russell, thank you very much for a stimulating and eye-opening presentation, and for being brave, being very brave. And I take Skura's point. There's far too little discussion about race in our country. I think one of the problems is, to be quite frank, I'm a relatively recent arrival in the area, having come from the north of the Zambezi, that is. But one of the things that I do find in our area is that Durbanites are incredibly parochial, know very little about what happens in the rest of Africa. Very few seem to have worked in places like Maputo or Harare or Lusaka or Nairobi. And I would encourage young architects to think about that seriously and get a broader view of our continent. That's the first important thing. But my question is fairly prosaic, and you have opened quite a Pandora box to think about in the whole process of urbanization and so on, and the Durban city meltdown. One thing I think it is also important to realize that Durban city sure is in a pickle, and we need to sort it out. And we have a responsibility as designers to address that particular problem. But there are areas, there are parts of eThekwini that are vibrant and growing, very active. And we need to maybe think a little bit about why. Why are they growing? Why is Mhlanga growing? Why is Pinetown a vibrant part of the urban scene? But on the basis of that, my view is that cities are essentially economic centers. We're here in order to make a living, exist, make money. And in fact, architects are no more than a service branch of the whole economic scene. We're here to produce things, to make things, and to get paid for it. But over and above that, there's a big move at the moment in Durban, for all sorts of good reasons and the right reasons, to establish and grow and build social housing. Now, what's your view about social housing coming before the creation of employment opportunities in the city? Architects, at the end of the day, are at the coalface. We're the guy that are actually going to produce the facility in which people can live and work. What's your view about building? I'm assisting at the moment on a fairly large scheme to house 250 families in a new and adapted complex. It's using buildings. I certainly have a deep interest in heritage architecture, but at the end of the day, all architecture is there to serve human needs. It has to be adapted to the way we live now, not the way we lived 100 years ago. So what's your thoughts about establishing social housing and pushing huge amounts of money into social housing before people have some sort of end function, end use? Over to you, Russell. Thanks.
This is a big question, no? But thanks, Ken. I mean, I'm no specialist on social housing. My own observations is that the township will be quite critical and crucial through the backroom housing kind of infrastructure to hold a kind of a huge demand for housing. The policy framework is super complicated to work around at a kind of at various levels of governments. But I mean, there's someone that I've been told of who makes about 40,000 rands through rental income. They own like 5 or 6 properties where they've like built these like double-story kind of, you know, dense housing complexes across the Durban townships, as well as the informal settlements. And so there's a really important role that kind of built form could help in holding. But if those structures are illegalized, then we have a bigger problem to think about. But I think it again speaks to the reference points through which we look. I mean, there's a planner from India. His name is Gautam Ban, and he was talking about needing. He makes his case about a project that needed to be a kind of a supply of mobile clinics that needed to be rolled out in a city. I can't remember which city it was in India. And the national government was responsible for this kind of rollout of this project, but the local government had refused because they did not have enough space. Yeah. And so the national government said, well, there is enough space. Yeah, we can squat. And the national government said, the local government said, no, you can't do that. It's the bylaws don't allow, et cetera, et cetera. And it said the only way we can roll out as many clinics in the time that is needed for us to kind of contain this whatever epidemic that they were dealing with is to squat. So there's a realization, there's a knowledge that we have to be counterintuitive in how we act to respond and resolve the issues that we're facing with. But somehow there's this kind of strong hold that the reference books tell us how a built form should look, how an urban condition should look, what is order, what is disorder, even when we see that this manual is not working for us. If anything, it's failing us, right? And so I don't have a direct answer to your question, but this is one way of thinking around the problem of always needing to kind of look in the places we've always looked. I think there are other places for us to look at, and maybe to liberate some of the bylaws that kind of constrict the conditions for us to resolve some of our problems at scale.
Russell, I agree with you. We are hidebound by regulations in our country. Just too much legislation and too little ability to apply it. That's one of the problems we have. But having said all of that, the one thing that amazes me is that there is an astonishing amount of enterprise initiative within should I say, the common man. The amazing effort and energy that goes into building squatter camps, why can we not harness that? Surely we should be harnessing the actual individual efforts of people. It's called self-help. And there needs to be some strong approach through the architectural profession for guided and assisted self-help in getting people to actually help to actually create things for themselves. I reckon that architects can do a hang of a lot in this direction. Anyway, that's my say. Thank you very much.
Thank you too.
Thank you so much, Ken. I do think that over-regulation really gets in the way. There's a meeting we had with the city on when the city said the architects can actually help after the floods, where all the members said we are here to try and we are available to volunteer to rebuild schools and houses, and the city says no, but we don't have a situation where you can just do it for free. And they say we wanted to do it for free. So now imagine trying to do that in assisting people put up their own housing. We are just simply over-regulated. That's very true, Ken.
I also want to
Russel.
acknowledge, if I may, Skura, all the comments that have been coming through the chat. I also don't want to be this kind of person who has an answer for every question. So if I just acknowledge, it's not because I don't value your contribution and your questions. Sometimes it's healthy to listen and take something in.
Thank you. Prof. Adebayo? I think you're muted, Prof. Yeah.
My intention was to listen to his presentation before, but I must commend him very well that he took architecture beyond, or he defined for me architecture in totality, not just as an object of a building. That is how his presentation worked, and that we must commend him for. And the issue of culture and architecture and democratization of the city. And that is a very big thing in architecture that we need to talk. When we talk about democratization, people talk only in politics, but they never talk about how it affects the built environment. And that's what the guy has tried to explain to us, where that democratization also must also be inclusive culture, because of those culture was not there, but one that came forward. And when the new one come, it should be an accommodating. That's what we talked to when we discussed about the inclusive cities. He has defined it in such a way that it's very interesting for every one of us to think about it. Now, having talking about heritage too, also, which Ali Mansouri was talking about triple heritage Africa. So his argument was that all these things that have gone before, that we didn't like, the one we like, and all those things is also part of our heritage. But the argument is that how do we accommodate the new culture within the city, within the building? And I think that is what I really like of it. And also he analyzed a lot of issue about the problem in the city, how we should respond to it. I like his approach, because I will take COVID, for example. When COVID came, everybody was complaining, they was find this or that. And what he was telling us, when this problem is there, we talk about, but we never find solution to those problems. That is innovative. But in the COVID, all of you take that as an analysis, scientific analysis, because architecture is science too. So how a lot of things have, technological things have been developed to resolve the problem of, as we are talking now, if not because of COVID, this would have not happened. The issue of bylaw that we are talking before, where you go to, when you build a house and you want to create a little office, the city will say you can have 2 people, 3 people, this, all those nonsense doesn't happen anymore. You can convert the whole house. Even the boundary of where office and residential will be have been blurred. You can be in America, in Europe, in everywhere that has happened, you can begin to work here. So I want us to be thinking how science has resolved those things and how we can use the same methodological approach in architecture and the city so that we don't think architecture as an object and for one particular person. So that is one thing. To the heritage also, I think our heritage thinking also need to change, need to find an innovative function, because there has been an argument about all those things in the early days in most of the European city. You want us to accept the heritage of the past and what of us, and that's why they try to bring the conservation into it and make sure that the building outside along the street remain the same. I work in some of them in the 80s. But when you enter inside, my God, you will see the new generation inside, new, beautiful, everything is. So it's talking about the integration, the inclusive. So when we're talking inclusive city, it's not only to bring people along, also the activities in your architecture must also be inclusive so that you can accommodate the culture. So that is what I think, that is the direction we should be taking architecture here. And the problem you are talking now, that problem, we have to be finding an innovative thinking to the planning, to the urban design, to the architecture, like the chamber thing you mentioned. Why is it that if they want to come, the bylaw say you can only stay by the side of a highway, like the one on the pavilion there, small little thing, it must be closer to the, what do you call it, industrial area or squatter settlement. Why can it not be in the city center? So those are those issues that I think you brought that I would like to comment. And the colleague who talked about the social housing, and I think the social housing also in South Africa need to be redefined properly. I think the issue of self-help and all those things, I do agree with it. And there's so many variations of self-help that exist that you can't have somebody who is not technically competence to be doing something technical. It depends on the type of building, because so that's one thing that we have to look. But the issue of social housing, if you look at how social housing have been put together and the foundation of social housing, it's not about rental housing alone. I think that's where we lost the debate about social housing. If all of you have known about Castman's Hove, please go and read the work. The man drew a ship, and inside that ship, he put different type of, so when you are in a ship, old, young, poor, rich, everything is inside. That is his definition of a social housing, so that the people can come to it more or less like a Noah ark, where you take different animals and bring them together. So that is what we are going, this idea of social housing for those little, small, rich, poor people, all those sort of things, we are still creating another type of economic segregation. So we must find a way of creating either a neighborhood, not only the building, and that's why I like your presentation. You don't talk about building alone, you talk about the space. You talk about the composition of a place. So how do we bring all those things together so that all these different people or different economic groups can continue to stay together? Because we've moved apartheid segregation, which is racial. Then we are now in economic segregation, which is the most dangerous thing. And how do we break that? And I think that's what we need to look at. I don't want to go into the debate of social housing. We can have a special time to debate about that. There's so many classifications of that social housing. South Africa took just the rental one, and it has not been successful because of just renter. Okay, it could be renter to rent to own, which many countries have that, and the integration. I would like to stop there. I enjoyed his presentation. He opened so many aspects of area that everybody should take a bit of it and study further in future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you for the comment, Prof. Mike?
Morning, Russell. We haven't met before, but we meet online. Very interesting discussion. It comes on the, and I did put a note on the chat. It comes in the context of a recent program that I saw Annika Larsen give an interview to Gigi Alcock, who is his family gave up everything and moved to Mzinga and lived with the community in Mzinga as a white family. He grew up as a a black boy. But he has the theory of Kasinomics. And I'm not sure whether I'm quite sure you're aware of it. But for me, it was probably one of the most revealing bits of information that I've had when one talks about people being gainfully employed and the need for the economy to grow and create jobs. He has studied it to the extent that his view is that our unemployment rate in South Africa is nothing like where it is, because those are statistics based off a traditional formal system. Reality is that the innovation and the ability to create jobs is extensive. And Kasinomics, which is the township economy, it was an absolute mind blower for me. I've just got his book. I've just started, it's opening up a whole new world. So anybody else, G.G. Alcock, and the reason for his name, he changed his initials to GG because the government vehicles in the ODAR used to have GG on it. And he was somehow linked to that. But thanks for a fascinating talk. I've had a bit of a wide opening, my eyes wide opened in the last couple of weeks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you. Skura, I'm aware that we are 8 minutes past 9, so I'll take your lead here.
Yeah. No, we will still take a hand if it's there. I don't think it is. But yeah, I think very, very relatable talk, Russel. Thank you so much. Perhaps you can just say a few closing words.
I haven't prepared for a few closing words. I think what I maybe might add is the fact that I'm also thinking through these things, like I hope the rest of us are. And Mike, I was going to say to you, I mean, you've opened another chapter of a South Africa that was closed to you. And I know that all of us around this table have the same blind spots, so to speak. I'm sorry to use ableist language here. And I would really encourage us that the South Africa that we exist and live in is so diverse, it's so rich, it's so multi-layered. And I don't think the problems of tomorrow will be answered by the answers that are informed by the experiences that are cocooned and kind of limited to the conditions and the ways that we lead our lives. And I'm super, super open for people to counter what I say and counter propose, and from there we can all learn. So yeah, I don't want to kind of position myself as someone who's got this like perfect calibration of how to navigate the complexities of Durban. I was thinking out loud and kind of using my personal and family history as a way to open up a conversation and invite the rest of you to work from that point of vulnerability or kind of openness, or however you want to frame it. So maybe that's how I would close it, Skura. And I'm super, super grateful for you to be in front of your computer at 7:30 on a Friday morning, all the way till 9:10, to listen to me waffle on and on.
Thank you so much, Russel and Humble. Colleagues, let me just say one announcement. Following the talk by the city, thanks to VP Adima Davis, who suggested a follow-up session because the questions were not all answered after that talk. So on the 6th of March, midweek, I think we'll have about 2 hours, and there will be guys also from the planning department. If you have questions on plan submission in Durban, there's a project of yours that is just not going anywhere, please come through. It'll be in person, 160 Bula Road, and also online at the same time. But we need questions that come from membership who are having problems with submission. The guys will make time, they promised us. So please diarize for that. I think it's important. But otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. Thank you, Russel. We'll see you again on the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, Guru. Thanks, Russell. Hope to see you on the 6th of March, Russell. Bye-bye.
I'll try.
Thank you, Russell.
Thank you too. Goodbye, everyone.
Shot, Russell. Thanks, man.
All right, who's this? Thank you.
Cameron.
Hey, man, how you doing? Thank you.